Welcome back to Long Delay's Hobbies. Today I'm going to be painting up one of my favorite characters from the movies, which is Gandalf the White. Now, as anyone who has been in this hobby for any amount of time can tell you, painting up white can be a bit of a challenge, so I'm going to walk you through the method that I used to paint this miniature, because almost all this model is obviously white. Probably the most important thing is to start with a white primer rather than a black or gray primer. I used a white primer from the Vallejo Hobby Paint line, but you can probably use just any hobby grade white primer. When it comes to white, I've found it very important to use a hobby grade primer rather than just something you pick up from the hardware store. So we've got Gandalf primed. Let's get started with our paints. Now we're going to start by painting off Shadowfax's coat, mane, and tail with some Ulthuan Gray Air. I used a couple coats of the Ulthuan Gray here because it is an air paint. It's rather thin, so I wanted to make sure that that coat was pretty smooth. So it took a couple of coats to ensure that the paint went on smoothly. And in order to wash the recesses of Shadowfax's coat, we need to use Apothecary White. So I'm just going around Shadowfax and looking for the crevices. For example, the mane and tail, the areas where there's some additional musculature, and just anywhere where I think it should be just a little bit darker. Now to paint Gandalf's cloak, I used Vallejo Game Ghost Gray. You could probably get away with something like Administratum Gray from the Warhammer line. Now you do run the risk of just a lot of white on white on white when it comes to painting Gandalf the White. So I tried to use a slightly different shade of white whenever I painted Gandalf's cloak. To paint Gandalf's skin tone, I used Bugman's Glow, being very careful to avoid the white parts that I had painted earlier. And this was the tricky part. I used a very small detail brush to paint up Gandalf's belt and scabbard with Rhinox hide. One thing that's interesting about this model is that Shadowfax does not have reins, unlike almost every other Warhammer or Middle-earth horse I've ever seen. So you don't need to worry about painting anything on Shadowfax using Rhinox hide. Next up, we're going to paint the silvers using Vallejo gunmetal. That's really just going to be Glamdring, the faux hammer, as well as the end point of his scabbard. Now, the outer cloak that Gandalf is wearing is more of a cream color rather than a pure white, and so to reflect that, we're going to use Shafty Bone. Now I wanted to keep that cream color, so rather than giving it an all-over wash, I used a pin wash of Citadel Contrast Guilliman Flesh, going through different cracks and crevices that this flowing cloak provides us. And I then wanted to put down a very thin wash of Nuln Oil. I used a 1-to-1 mix of Nuln Oil and Lamian Medium to wash Gandalf's staff, his hair, and to wash the shaded areas in his cloak. And to wash his skin tone, I used Reikland Flesh Shade. So I then used some Screaming Skull to highlight up the Ushabti bone cloak that Gandalf was wearing, as well as the boots. And I then used some Gorthar Brown just to pick out a few highlights on the belt and scabbard. Now, Shadowfax is not a pure white horse in the sense that he's not white from top to bottom, although he's almost entirely white. He does have a black muzzle and some black hooves. So in order to paint those details on Shadowfax, I used some thinned down Corvus Black applied in a few subsequent layers. And I painted up some detail on Gandalf's skin using some Cadian flesh tone. And with that, our Gandalf the White is ready for the table after a little bit of basing. He's ready to charge out of the gate onto the Pelennor. I think he turned out really well for a model that is almost entirely white. And I think the key is, number one, priming him in white, as well as varying up your white tones. And just being a little bit more lenient with your washes. They should probably be applied a little bit more sparingly and thinned down in order to ensure that they don't overpower that white. But I hope you have enjoyed watching this How I Painted video. I would be ever so thankful if you click those like and subscribe buttons on your way out. If you have any questions about how I painted this miniature, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. But most importantly, don't forget to have a great day. Take care.